Question for you. Do you ever cry? I think probably we all do. It'd be strange if you said you didn't, really, I reckon. Question for you. What makes you cry? Anyone want to say what makes them cry? Anyone bold enough to want to offer up what makes... Romantic movies. You've got a nod from a couple of other people there. Okay, romantic movies. You've got a laugh. You've got some nods and some laughs there. That was an interesting mix. Anything else? Onions. Sorry, what was that? What was that, Anne?
I said some music.
Some music, okay. And there was something else on this side. Death of a pet. Mm-hmm. Okay. Loss. The news. Okay. Yeah. Suffering. Yeah. Okay. Have you ever hurt yourself so badly you cried? You don't think there was some you haven't? Oh, okay. Ever been so sad you cried? Ever had your feelings hurt so much that you cried? Ever cried because someone else was crying? Oh, that one got quite a reaction. That was interesting. We've already had this one a bit, but ever cried because of a film? Not all of you, though. A number, but some of you. I've done that. Yeah, that one's got me. Shadowlands, that's the film that gets me crying every time. Don't matter how many times I watch it. Shadowlands just has me in absolute floods of tears. It's, very powerful. We all cry. I think we've established that. Whatever it might be different things that get us crying, onions or romantic films or music or whatever it is. We all cry for some reason at some point. And even Jesus cried. We know that. The shortest verse in the Bible, we're all familiar with it. It comes up in today's reading. It tells us Jesus wept. We can find 3 examples actually of Jesus crying within our scriptures. There's that one in our reading where Jesus goes to the tomb of Lazarus. There is a passage in Hebrews chapter 5 that tells us, while Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears. And in Luke's gospel we read, as he, that is Jesus, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. And then, of course, as I say, in our reading from John's Gospel, after the death of Lazarus, Jesus meets Mary, who is herself weeping, and goes to the tomb of Lazarus and cries himself. Deep grief at that point. But the story doesn't end there with the grief and the tears at the tomb of Lazarus, because Jesus raises Lazarus to life again. He turns Mary's tears of sadness into tears of joy. And the good news is that he continues to turn sadness into joy. That life is stronger than death, and that he promises us a future without tears of sadness. This is the good news that comes in Jesus. He understands our feelings of loss and sadness. He understands our tears. The psalmist writes about asking God to keep our tears in a bottle. God perhaps doesn't do that, literally, but he understands our tears. He knows our feelings of pain and sadness and loss. And he promises to change those feelings into feelings of joy when things are transformed by the God who transforms all. We're going to listen to this story where Jesus comes and transforms all in the lives of Mary and Martha and Lazarus.
Our reading is from John, chapter 11, beginning at verse 17. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had been buried 4 days before. Bethany was less than 3 kilometers from Jerusalem, and many Judeans had come to see Martha and Mary to comfort them over their brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "If you had been here, Lord, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask him for." "Your brother will rise to life," Jesus told her. "I know," she replied, "that he will rise to life on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she answered, "I do believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who was to come into the world." After Martha said this, she went back and called her sister Mary privately. "The teacher is here," she told her, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up and hurried out to meet him. But Jesus had not yet arrived in the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The people who were in the house with Mary, comforting her, followed her when they saw her get up and hurry out. They thought that she was going to the grave to weep there. Mary arrived where Jesus was, and as soon as she saw him, she fell at his feet. "Lord," she said, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus saw her weeping, and he saw how the people who were with her were weeping also. His heart was touched, and he was deeply moved. "Where have you buried him?" he asked them. "Come and see, Lord," they answered. Jesus wept. "See how much he loved him," the people said. But some of them said, "He gave sight to the blind man, didn't he? Could he not have kept Lazarus from dying?" Deeply moved once more, Jesus went to the tomb, which was a cave with a stone placed at the entrance. "Take the stone away," Jesus ordered. Martha, the dead man's sister, answered, "There will be a bad smell, Lord. He has been buried 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believed?" They took the stone away. Jesus looked up and said, "I thank you, Father, that you listen to me. I know that you always listen to me, but I say this for the sake of the people here, so that they will believe that you sent me." After he had said this, he called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" He came out, his hands and feet wrapped in grave clothes, and with a cloth round his face. "Untie him," Jesus told them, "and let him go." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
The raising of Lazarus is arguably Jesus' most dramatic and powerful miracle. In it, he shows authority over life and death. Yet it also begins to prepare everyone, including Jesus himself, for his own death. Following this miracle, Jesus is anointed, and then he speaks of his hour of glorification, and then he speaks of the idea of a grain having to die so that it might rise. These things all follow on from this miracle, preparing people for what is going to happen. And if you struggle in any way with Jesus' divinity, if you struggle in any way with Jesus' miracles, then this story here from John's Gospel, this story is literally incredible. It is beyond credibility. Let's look, though, at the prelude to our reading, the first 16 verses of that chapter. We're in Bethany, the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. It's a small place, less than 2 miles east of Jerusalem. And it was used regularly as a base by Jesus when he was near Jerusalem, much like Capernaum was when he was in Galilee. It was that place that he went to. And Mary and Martha and Lazarus were close to Jesus. They were dear to him. They were loved by him. We are told this a number of times throughout this chapter. In verse 3, we're told that the sisters sent word to Jesus saying, "Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." In verse 5, we read, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus." And in verse 36, after Jesus cries, the Jews were saying, "See how he loved him." So Jesus is particularly close to this family. But as we know, Lazarus then falls ill, and Mary and Martha know that Jesus can help, so they send word to him. The message comes to him, it seems, without a name, but Jesus knows who it is. They don't ask him to come directly, but that must be their implicit desire. His response in verse 4 is this sickness is not to end in death. It appears to be a false statement. But of course, in the light of what happens, it highlights how God is glorified in the story and that death does not reign in the end. But after hearing about Lazarus, Jesus waits 2 more days before travelling to Bethany. So can Jesus be blamed for allowing Lazarus to die, just to enable God to be glorified? If so, how can this glorify God? Is it not simply cruel? But note that when Jesus does arrive in Bethany, he discovers that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Thus, his delay of 2 days could not be considered responsible for Lazarus' death. It's quite possible, in fact, that Lazarus died soon after the messenger set off from Bethany to find Jesus to bring him the message. So we come to our reading. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. There was a well-known Jewish belief that a person's soul remained near the body for 3 days after death, hoping to re-enter the body. But once the body started to decay, that soul departed. So we are told, according to Jewish folklore, according to Jewish custom, we are told that Lazarus is most definitely dead. He's been dead 4 days. His soul has departed. There was no doubt. There is no equivocation about this. Lazarus is dead. And this is emphasised later when Jesus asks for the stone to be rolled away from the tomb. Martha said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." But Jesus comes to Bethany. He meets both Martha and Mary in turn. And Martha expresses her sadness and her disappointment as she meets him and speaks to him. She says, "If only." You can hear in those words her pain, can't you? "If only," she says to him. But Jesus then challenges her about the resurrection, and Martha speaks of a commonly, although not universally, held belief that there would be resurrection at the end times. Jesus replies by saying that not only is resurrection possible now, but that he himself is the resurrection and the life, and that those who believe in him will have life. It's important to note, of course, that Jesus does not claim that people will not die, just that such death is not the end. Martha then shows her faith through stating that she believes in him. And what a wonderful moment this is, because contrast this with how she's commonly viewed through the lens of the story in Luke's Gospel, that famous story of Mary and Martha, where Mary is the good one who sits at Jesus' feet and laps up everything he teaches, while Martha bustles about in the kitchen getting everything ready and fusses and gets upset with what Mary's doing. And we look at Martha then, don't we? And we tut and we say, well, look, come on, Martha, you need to be doing the right thing. But here, in this story, Martha's shown as someone who has a deep faith. She understands something of who Jesus is. She understands something of what Jesus can do. If only you'd been here, you could have done something, she starts off with. But as this conversation with Jesus goes on, how she develops. Yes, I believe. Yes, yes, Lord. And then Jesus meets Mary, and she expresses her sadness and her disappointment just like her sister did. And Jesus is moved by what he sees. But what is this? Is it emotion? Is it grief? Is it sadness? Is it anger? A combination of all these things? What exactly is going on with him? And both Mary and the crowd are weeping. And of course, remember, it's not weeping in a very British way. We tend to read these scriptures, don't we, with our own lens, our own way of thinking. It's not weeping in that very British way. They're not doing that. This is a very Middle Eastern grief, remember. Remember where we are. We're in the Holy Land. This is that sort of expressive, wailing, pouring out grief that we often see. We see sometimes on the television when there is something tragic going on in those nations. This is a real outpouring of grief going on amongst this community. Jesus asks where Lazarus is buried. He's taken there and he weeps himself. And again, we're told that Jesus was moved or groaned. The Greek word is a very powerful word that speaks of him being moved deep within him. We've talked about this before in sermons. It's not a superficial thing. It's a movement deep within the soul, the body. And then after getting the people to remove the stone from the entrance to the tomb, Jesus prayed and then calls Lazarus out of the tomb. Can you even begin to imagine being there at that moment? What it must have been like to that drama of, come on, roll away that stone. No, don't do that. It would stink, Lord. No, do it. And then, however you depict it, whether you think of Robert Powell or any of those great depictions on television of whatever, but Lazarus, come forth. And then him coming out in bound, however, in those wrappings for the tomb, coming out of that tomb again. What it must have been like, what the effect it must have had on those people around to see him after 4 days dead come out of the tomb. So what message, what teaching do we take from this passage? Well, at the centre of this whole passage, at the centre of this whole story is death. And death is something that we have really as a society gradually become less and less aware of, as well as less and less familiar with. Certainly we had, anyway, up until the pandemic came along, it perhaps became a little bit more into our consciousness again, didn't it then? Of course, people still die, just as they always have, but nowadays it's more often than not something that happens outside of our personal experience, unless it is a loved one. And this happening outside of our own personal experience is something that is unique to our day and age. It wasn't always the way through history. It's not the way in other cultures. But for our Western culture, our civilised culture, it's very much unique to our day and age that death happens elsewhere to other people. And strangely enough, or maybe it's not at all strangely enough, death has not lost its fear over us. Literature, film, myth and folklore all play upon our fear of death and the dead. We come at the end of this month and the turning into the next month of these days that focus on this. The 31st of October, to the pleasure of many and the despair of others, is Halloween or All Hallows Eve. Traditionally, a day for driving out evil. It's where the origins of what we now experience, that very commercialised celebration for many people, is where it comes from. The driving out of evil. It was a church tradition originally. Halloween or All Hallows Eve. The 1st of November is All Hallows or All Saints' Day. Traditionally a day for commemorating the saints that do not have their own feast day. Churches that are more conformist, not like our non-conformist day, but have almost every day of the year has a saint attached to it, and then there are other saints that don't have a day, and they were the ones who were celebrated on All Saints' Day. And for many people, All Saints' Day is a time to think of those who have died in Christ and know something of what God's glory is now, as they wait for that time of the new creation. And then the following day, the 2nd of November, is All Souls' Day, which was traditionally a day for remembering and praying for those who had died but had not yet reached heaven. Going way back in time, that was praying for those whose souls were in purgatory, when people strongly felt and thought about that. That's where the origins of All Souls' Day and praying for people came from there. So these 3 days come at the end of October and November, focusing on people who have died. And each of these elements, fiction, myth, tradition, experience, all add to our perception of and reaction to death. They're all there in our consciousness somewhere, whether we focus on them directly or not. They're there. They're in our society. They're in our culture. They're in our mind somehow, our consciousness. They're there. They play into what goes on. But what this passage and the story that follows it tells us is that we should no longer fear death. It doesn't mean that we should not grieve over the death of someone close to us or over a loved one. Indeed, Jesus' own grief and acceptance of others' grief shows that there is nothing wrong with this most human of emotions. It is the most natural of emotions. It also shows us that we can get angry at death. However, as I've said, even though death will upset us, we should not fear it in any way. And more than that, we should also rejoice in the life that Jesus gives us. It's not simply a belief in what is to come, because if that's all we have, something to look forward to one day, then what's life now? You know, that's often the way we look at things, isn't it? That's the way traditionally churches often look at things, that one day there'll be heaven. And that's great. But if that's all we've got to look forward to is, well, one day there's heaven, what's life now? What is the point? Actually, what God says to us is there is a point to now as well. It's about living in the now. Yes, there is a future prepared for us. There will be a new creation when all that is bad is done away with, and all those tears and sadness and mourning and grief and death will be done away with, and there'll be a new creation that will be full of joy and wonder and beauty. And it'll be the Garden of Eden recreated, and we'll be there in God's presence. And what a beautiful, beautiful vision that is placed before us. What a beautiful hope that is. But that's not all. What God says is now is important as well. We pray, your kingdom come on earth as in heaven. We don't pray, oh, let's worry about the future one day. Your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And God calls us to bring about that now for people. God calls us to make people's lives better. God calls us to bring comfort to those who are suffering. God calls us to bring joy into people's lives. God calls us to come alongside those who are grieving. God calls us to come alongside those who are in trouble. God calls us to bring something of God's love into people's lives, something of God's kingdom into people's lives, so that it might be built now. Because God's kingdom has broken into this world. We are free because God has shown us through Jesus that he has power over death. It means not only do we have life to look forward to, but that we also have life now. And therefore, we should ensure that we live it. Not just muddle about waiting for the end, waiting for the new creation, but truly living life in all its fullness as Jesus promises to us. May we truly seek to live life in all its fullness. May we revel in the joy and the promise of glory that God gives us. May we be blessed by God's grace. And may we seek to share his love and his grace and his mercy with others day by day as we seek to build his kingdom here on earth. May we do all that God calls us to as we walk hand in hand with him.